Hi, that is week one done already. I hope you've taken the time to do the exercises and have found them useful, but also taken time to do your reflection work as well. The more you put into these exercises, the more you put into delving deeper and gaining better understanding, the more you're going to get out of this course. So, moving into week two, two more lessons for you to work on this week. The first lesson is going to be exploring your emotional triggers a bit more deeply. And the fourth lesson is about breaking the cycle of emotional eating. Now, I'm sure you're excited about that one. And we're going to look at something called mindful eating, and it's a lovely practice to get into. Before we get started on this week's exercises, I just want to take a bit of time to talk about your inner child, or the concept of the inner child. So by now, you've already started to explore your relationship with food growing up. So you're already starting to see that our experiences when we're very young can have a big impact on us as adults. And I've shared some of my own stories of some of the relationship that I had with my mum and how that's influenced my overeating and my emotional eating into adult life. But it's not just our eating that is affected or that gets sculpted in childhood. Okay, when I talk about the concept of the inner child, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I do actually run an inner child course, but I think it's really valuable to understand the concept of the inner child because it's really helpful when starting to explore emotional triggers. So our inner child, okay, even though we present in adult bodies, our responses are not always in line with our adult selves. Quite often, the way in which we respond in situations is quite childlike, okay. So, our inner child, okay, when we talk about the inner child concept, is all of our thoughts, feelings, and experiences that we had as children growing up. Now, it's important to point out here inner child work isn't about beating up our parents, okay? It is about just starting to explore and understand the decisions that we made in childhood that have influenced us growing up. And of course, our thoughts and feelings and our view of the world is being challenged and changed all the time, certainly as we're growing into toddlers and teenagers and then into adults. But quite a lot of that stuff doesn't get changed and then just becomes such a familiar pattern to us. It's like it's always been there. So when I talk about the inner child, what I'm making reference to is our emotional responses to things, okay? And what happens as we go through our days, so in the here and now as adults, as we go through our days, things happen that trigger us, okay? And an emotional trigger is often something that momentarily takes us back to a time in our younger days where something happened, and at that point we made a decision to react in a certain way. Okay, so it could be that as a child you were bullied. Okay, it might have been that there was a bully at school that kind of put you through hell on a daily basis, and something may happen in the here and now where you're at work and someone does something and it really takes you back momentarily to those days when you were bullied. And that's what I call an inner child trigger or an emotional trigger. So you can see why starting to understand your inner child and the concept of the inner child is really important as we start to explore emotional triggers a little bit more this week. As children, we all have experienced some level of trauma, from mum throwing our favourite toy away to, of course, the deeper levels of abuse. Okay, so our connection and our pull to childhood is something we experience over and over again in adulthood. And of course, what happens is we find ways of coping with these emotional triggers, and food or alcohol or drugs or sex or gambling all become ways in which we learn to cope with and deal with these emotional pulls that seem to kind of keep us stuck a little bit in our lives. I find the concept of the inner child a really powerful way of working with clients and helping them to understand their emotional self, because you kind of can imagine this little child, and it might be quite upsetting, especially if you've experienced some upsetting stuff in childhood, but it's a really nice way of tangibly being able to connect with this younger part of self. You know, I actually do some lovely work on my own inner child, where I use a cushion, and if I'm feeling upset, I spend some time where I just hold the cushion. It's almost like I'm soothing that part of me, but in a way that doesn't involve food. So there are some love, you know, once you can actually start connecting to this emotional part of self, that's when you can actually start to look for soothing yourself in different ways. So your exercise, your first lesson for this week, is about delving a little bit deeper into emotional triggers. If you haven't done so already, do download your workbook for week 2. That will have been sent to you in an email, or if you're working from a journal, do get that out and ready, and you will need to draw yourself a little framework to be working from this week. So identifying emotional triggers is what we're going to delve into more deeply this week. And in the exercises in week 1, you did touch on this, but this is something now that I want you to get better at doing on a day-to-day basis. Okay, I cannot, when we start looking at breaking the cycle of emotional eating, I cannot stress enough how important awareness is in this process. Awareness of what's triggering you on a day-to-day basis. You know, once you can start to gain better awareness, this is when you can start to actually look for solutions in the right place or not. You know, sometimes acceptance and knowledge is actually enough to see things start to change. So your first exercise this week is you starting to really hone in on your own emotional triggers. And emotional triggers can come in a number of forms. So they can be people. I'm sure you know there are certain people in your life that when you're in their company, they kind of just push your buttons. So there will be people that emotionally trigger you. Okay, so these are the sorts of things we're looking for. There'll also be environments that you're triggered in. You know, it could be something on the telly that triggers you. It could be smells. So being in a room where you see food. So your senses are quite important when it comes to emotional triggers. So what I want you to do for this week and going forward is start to really become more tuned into the emotional shifts that you have. So where you go from 1 minute feeling okay and the next minute feeling a shift, that maybe you feel frustrated, it may be that you feel sad, it might be that you feel angry. So starting to recognize when you get these emotional shifts. And what I want you to do is I just want you to start documenting what you're experiencing and what's coming up for you. And I want you to start by just sitting down with the workbook, with the worksheet, and it's broken down into 3 sections. So you've got the trigger section, you've got the emotional response, and then the emotion that you felt, and then the response to the emotion. So at this point, I don't want you to take any action. I just want you to be curious, and I want you to be much more mindful and aware of what's going on for you. Okay, so the first thing is the trigger. So that could be that you had a phone call with your mum. Okay, so that's the emotional trigger. How did that make you feel? Okay, so it might be that you came off that phone call feeling quite frustrated and angry, and then looking at the response, what happened? So was it that you went and had a bit of cake, or you had a packet of crisps, or you made yourself some toast? So what I want you to start by doing is doing this retrospectively, because I think before we get good at identifying this stuff as it happens, we learn by looking at what's already gone on before. So I want you to just take a bit of time, sit down with your paper and your journal, and I want you to think about a time when you last overate or you emotionally ate. Okay, and then try to backtrack, try to think about what was the trigger for doing that, how were you feeling, and what did you do? What was the response to the feeling? So what you're starting to do is start to build up a picture of the patterns that you go through, what the trigger is, what the feeling was, and how you responded in response to those feelings. So that's your exercise 3. There's a little bit more information around it in the actual lesson. So do click on the link, have a read, and then have a go at lesson 3. Good luck. And don't forget your reflection work at the end. You know, getting into a habit of thinking about how you found the activity. Was it easy? Did you find it hard? What came up for you? That's doing your reflective work is as important as doing the exercises. So good luck and see you for lesson 4.